The guest is Dr. Burris-Kitchen from Tennessee State University, and she's talking about the criminal justice system in the United States. And of course, Dr. Kitchen, before we had our final commercial break, we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to continue talking about the institutionalization of racism in a real sense, that how that the whole issue is a part of and partial in a real sense of our society. So let's look at it from that perspective.
Well, where I kind of left off was the fact that all of a sudden the civil rights legislation was passed, and there are new freedoms for African Americans and other oppressed members of our society. But it was 1970. I mean, it wasn't even 5, maybe 6 years after this that the Nixon administration put an all-out affront on the war on drugs. And the war on drugs became a criminalization of black people. I mean, drugs meant black, black meant crime, drugs and crime meant let's lock up black people. And it was never this intense until the 70s. And what concerns me about that is once the de jure segregation and discrimination is gone, now all of a sudden you've got institutionalized racism, you've got the medial portrayal of the people who do drugs are African Americans. They're the people to fear as a group, not just, you know, we got to fear a person who does drugs, but we've got to fear the black male, because the black male is the drug dealer who's out killing people for drugs or killing people to sell drugs, and that's who we have to be careful about. So all of a sudden we've got a bunch more police officers in the street looking for the drug dealer who is African American male, supposedly, but that's not reality. Reality was not that that's who was selling drugs. Self-report studies on drug sales and drug use from 1970s on, which was data collected by the Michigan Alcohol and Other Drugs Survey for years, said that self-report studies say that white European American males are the ones who are the drug dealers and the drug users at a much higher rate than African American males. But the image of the media and the image of the political arena was that it was the African American male. So the African American male became the threat to the white population and the white politician and the white criminal justice system. So once that happened, more legislation continued to be passed that was about the war on drugs, and every president from Nixon on, that's what they fought for up until Barack Obama's administration. The war on drugs wasn't even really mentioned much at all, and this, because of the economy was so bad, I think other people wanted to hear other things besides the war on drugs. But any politician who ran for political office from the 70s on could not talk about the war on drugs and not talk about crime in general.
Troubled cities.
Right, or they would not, or troubled cities, or they would not have gotten elected. You had to say, what am I doing about crime? And you had to say, what am I doing specifically about the drug dealers on the street that are shooting each other? And that image of that drug dealer was an African-American male. So what are you doing about the inner city streets in America? What are you doing about the Detroits? What are you doing about the Chicagos? What are you doing about the LAs? So ever since then, we've had legislation that's been passed that's been revolving around this particular interest. And I think the most damaging was the crime control bill, which said if you got 5 grams of, just 5 grams of crack cocaine, you've got a mandatory minimum of 5 years in prison versus 500 grams of heroin versus 100 grams of regular cocaine. Well, we all know that cocaine is cocaine, whether it comes in the form of powder cocaine or rock. But we focused on, okay, we've got to get the people who have crack, and they're going to get, for 5 grams of crack, they're going to get the same time as someone who has 100 grams or 500 grams of cocaine or heroin. And the person who we saw as the crack dealer, specifically in the 80s, was the African-American male. So all of a sudden, we've got all these people out on the streets looking for the crack dealer who was only looking in African-American communities. That's where the law enforcement officers were put. Clinton's administration in the 90s also passed crime control legislation to put 100,000 more police officers on the street. Of course, that crime control legislation, 100,000 police officers went where?
Did that ever materialize? Did they ever, what was the purpose behind all of that?
They wanted more police officers on the street to fight this war on drugs, and they got their 100,000 more police officers, and there were 100,000 more police officers put on the streets, and those police officers were put in primarily minority communities to look for drug users and drug dealers, and they found them. So from there, what I wanted to look at is from 65, where we stopped basically before we started talking about what happened once freedoms were given that had been deserved and fought for so many years. Once those freedoms were given, all of a sudden you see the arrest rates of African Americans had remained at about 25%, anywhere between 25 and 30% from 1934, when the UCR started collecting arrest rate data. From 1934 until about 1966, arrest rates remained at about 25 to 30% for African Americans. And their prison population was at about 25 to 30%. So it matched the arrest population. Well, from the middle 60s on, what happened is you still have an arrest rate of African Americans that runs between 25 and 30% on a given year, but yet their prison population is made up 65 to 70% of our prison population is African American now. And if you look at the federal prisons and people who are in federal prisons for non-violent drug offenders, it's 85% of non-violent drug offenders that are in federal prisons are African Americans. And this is because this war on drugs, and what my concern is because of the whole issue of privatization of prison as well.
Speak to that.
Coming right alongside of this, okay, we're arresting all the drug dealers, and of course the drug dealers an African American, which we know they're not, and they're not arrested at anymore. You know, they're looking for the African American drug dealer, but they can't find them, right? Because
of the population.
they're still only having their arrest rate at 25 to 30%, but they've got all these police officers looking for them. They can't find them. So obviously that's not who's dealing drugs and not who's using them. But then at the same time, you got these disparities in arrest versus the incarceration rates, which it should be like this, but it's not. You've got privatization of prison. So you've got all these prisons opening up, and one in particular is opening up in or has opened up just in northern Virginia that used to be one of the largest slave plantations back in the 1800s in the United States. And they're taking all the prisoners from Washington, D.C., which primarily is going to be about 90% African American, and putting them in that prison in Virginia, which used to be slave plantation land. And they're in private prison doing labor for free in this private prison in Virginia, African American males who are in there for non-violent drug offenses.
Now, this has also been a part of the system in the state of Tennessee as well, has it not? The private penal systems and an effort on the part of some people to increase their numbers. Is that true in reference to your state here? Right.
Correctional Corporation of America is probably one of the biggest prison systems, and we have a Correctional Corporations is here in Nashville off of Harding Place, and they are housing a lot of inmates. And the reason why people are voting for and agreeing with and not screaming about this privatization of prison looking a lot like slavery is because it's coming under the umbrella of, well, it's saving the taxpayers' money. And we don't want to pay taxes to keep people locked up. So if the private prison can do it cheaper, let them do it. But what they don't understand is the private prisons are incarcerating people for profit. And they're going into these prisons and they're making clothing and they're booking your airline flights and they're getting credit card information off of people who are calling in to buy things. Prisoners are, you know, they're on the phone booking your airline flight and getting your credit card information. And, you know, which isn't a big concern to me because they're not going to do anything with that information.
This is still exploitation of labor.
But yeah, that's my concern. Is not that they're getting information, and it's that they're doing labor, making profit for corporations, and
which use them to expand the system itself and more.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you're incarcerating people for profit, then you're gonna want to put more and more people in prison. You're not going to want to solve crime. You're going to want to lock people up. Right.
Yes. Very good. And of course, we're nearing the end of this second segment here, Dr. Burris-Kitchen. And when we come back, we want to talk about some other aspects of overpopulation and overrepresentation of Africans and not only Africans, but as you indicate, people of color in the criminal justice system. And I think that we can really say from what you've already said in reference to it is that we are ripe for reform. If there was ever any kind of reform that could be a part of the system, certainly this would be the time that we could deal with the kind of reform that is necessary. And so when we come back, we want you to deal with some of those issues. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.